I was only 9 or 10 years old, so a lot of it is a blur. At first, my mom had me sleep in bed with her at night and was babying me, and I loved it. However, after my parents got divorced, my stepdad essentially moved right in and started sexually abusing me. I knew deep down that it was wrong, but I thought that since he was an adult, he knew what he was doing, and I trusted him. One night, my sister caught him red-handed, freaked out, and told my mom that the police had arrived, and he was arrested. We were walking home from school when we noticed my dad's van outside our house, which we were not permitted to enter, and we noticed trash bags outside. My dad explained to us that my mom had called him earlier in the week to threaten to get rid of us and not come out and talk to us if he didn't come get us. I sobbed. Since my dad lived in another state, this meant that we would have to leave our friends in our hometown, and they chased after the van as we drove away. For a few years, she wouldn't speak to us because had let my stepdad return, which is probably why she avoided us. She had opted for a man who had abused her child over her own children, and eventually we reconnected with her, but she was extremely ill. It's funny that she works in a very high-level position for one of the biggest banks in America, so people think she's fantastic, but she's a monster. I finally had the guts to break up with her when I went into recovery from heroin addiction 11 years ago, and I haven't spoken to her since. I've been an unwitting accessory to both of my parents' infidelity since I was just 5 years old. My mother cheated on my dad while he was deployed, and my brother told me about it and warned me not to tell anyone. My life has flourished since cutting her off, and people always say how much I need my mom, lol. Don't be afraid to boot family out of your life just because they're family. Thank you for letting me share this Reddit story. My parents are still married, but I'm not sure if either of them ever found out about the other's behavior or if either of them is still being unfaithful. Story 3. 2 days before my dad passed away, he called me to discuss his affair with his secretary. He would take me along on his dates with her, telling my mother that we were just going to the movies. On occasion, he even took me to her house, where her roommate would watch over me while he spent time with her in a separate room. Yes, I hung up on my suck father. He had been calling me for months, sharing his depressive feelings, and I was honestly sick of hearing it. 2 days later, on my 17th birthday, he took his own life. Everyone in the family thinks it was a coincidence, but I know better. I've never told anyone in my family the truth because I know they would blame me, especially my brother, and ever since his death, I've been plagued by recurrent nightmares in my dreams where I see my dad. Story 4. When I was younger, I lived with my grandmother. Shortly after I turned 18, her health began to deteriorate, the kind of decline where you know the end is inevitable. Over the course of the months, I did everything in my power to take care of her, making sure she survived. He pushes an empty shopping cart down an aisle, looks at me for a moment, and then continues on. When I run to where he was, he's suddenly at the other end of the aisle. Our family is unaware of what happened the night she passed away. I was watching TV in the living room when I heard my dog whimpering and barking while he was lying in bed with her. I knew what was going on deep down and knew that if I acted quickly, I might be able to save her, but I also knew how much pain she was in and how difficult it had been for her to live without being able to care. We also had a caregiver who came by every day to help with the thing I couldn't manage. My only regret is that she passed away a month after I should have graduated. If I hadn't been expelled from school, she would have been well enough to attend my graduation. It pains me to think that my actions deprived her of that moment, and I still punish myself for how careless I was at the time. Story 5. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, I was walking home with my dog after visiting a house around the. He cut through the yard of an elderly woman who lived at the end of the street on the way back. She was known to be cruel and unfriendly, and she was outside at the time caring for her carefully maintained rose bushes that border her yard and her neighbors. My dog, a kind and amiable golden retriever, didn't even approach her or do anything dangerous, even though she sprayed him with a chemical that was likely insecticide or something she was using on her roses. Panicked, I hurried home with my dog and he coughed a lot but otherwise appeared to be fine, so I didn't tell my parents about it because I was worried about getting in trouble for letting him wander into her yard. Looking back, I'm glad I didn't say anything because that night I decided to take matters into my own hands. I crept downstairs, climbed out of the half-bath window, and made my way to her yard under the cover of darkness. I chopped down every single rose bush I could reach. It was an act of pure childlike vengeance, and even though I know it wasn't the right thing to do, I've never. Story 6. About 2 years ago, my wife, her mother, and I purchased a house together. Shortly after we moved in, I began learning odd information about the previous owners from the neighbors. I discovered that their daughter was hanging around with some dubious people. One evening, someone knocked on our door and said he needed gas. Since we live at the end of a long driveway, it was difficult to believe this was a random visit, and I suspected he was searching for the previous occupants. When 4 sheriff's officers knocked on my door on a Sunday morning while I was preparing pancakes for my family, They said they had received a 911 call from our home that hung up. I told them that neither my wife nor our 2-year-old made the call, and they mentioned the names of the previous occupants. I told them that we had moved in earlier that year, and they seemed satisfied. Later, while doing some yard work, I struck up a conversation with one of the neighbors, who had noticed the police cars earlier, and when I asked him what had happened, he casually replied, "Oh yeah, that family was pretty messed up. The cops were probably being cautious because of the shooting." I asked him what the shooting was, and he looked at me with a mixture of sadness and concern. He then explained that there had been a shooting in your house, and I was shocked to learn that the father had confronted his daughter and her boyfriend, someone he didn't approve of, about 2 years prior, and that he had shot and killed the boyfriend inside the house in our state. Lacks a disclosure law, so we were unaware of it until all the strange events made sense. The neighbor mentioned that following the incident, the victim's friends terrorized the family with things like slashed tires, fireworks in the middle of the night, and other strange acts. I was shocked, but I was able to say, "That's crazy," but I begged my wife and mother-in-law not to tell anyone about it because they are already a little jumpy about things like this story 7. This isn't my secret, but my mom's, and while I'm not keeping it from them. When my mom was in high school in the 1960s, she had a long-term, serious boyfriend named Jimmy. They were each other's first love, dated for years, and even planned to get married. When Jimmy went off to college and my mom stayed behind, they remained together until the inevitable happened. He cheated and got another girl pregnant. When Jimmy returned home to tell my mom the news, he told her that he still wanted to be with her but felt he had no choice but to marry the. My mom was devastated by another girl. Here's the secret, she was also pregnant by Jimmy at the time, but she chose not to tell him. Jimmy went on to marry the other girl, and he was unaware of her pregnancy. Years later, when Facebook was just getting started, my mom asked me to look up Jimmy using my account because he was still married to the same woman my mom was married to my dad with, and they exchanged. I live in a small town where everyone knows each other or is connected in some way. I've always had family and friends, some best friends, some close friends, and some more casual acquaintances, but lately I feel like everyone has. I've been receiving messages through my account no less, and they sign their notes with "I love you." My mom passed away a number of years ago, and sometimes I think about this huge secret. I know Jimmy is unaware of a life-changing event for my mom that he never knew, and I don't plan to tell him. We used to have a group chat, but after I had a falling out with one of the group members, everything changed. I tried to patch things up by reaching out and apologizing, but it hasn't been the same since. I feel lonely and depressed. Seeing everyone else happy spending time together only makes it worse. Most of my time is spent alone, and occasionally they post about their gatherings on social media, and I've been excluded from gatherings, outings, and even small events. When I have enough money or the opportunity, I'm seriously considering leaving everything behind and moving somewhere new where no one knows me. At least there, I might finally feel free. I realize that they hide those posts from me because I have a private account that they follow, and for some reason, they don't block that one. It hurts. I thought they were my friends, so why go out of their way to hide things from me? Around 10 years ago, I intentionally sabotaged the finances of a church while I was its treasurer. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I felt it was the right thing to do. Both pastors were receiving ridiculously high salaries for the little work they were doing, and on top of that, they were wasting $5,000 a month on things the congregation was unaware of. One pastor flatly refused to follow the board's instructions, frequently giving money to people the board had specifically advised against helping. None of the board members wanted to be the bad guy, and technically I made clerical mistakes that almost bankrupted the church, but most people believe it was an accident. However, a few people who know the truth respect me for what I did. The pastors couldn't get the authorities involved because they knew I could expose everything and ruin their careers and personal lives, and many people in that church community still despise me. Nevertheless, I have no regrets because my actions brought attention to their unethical behavior, and I've gone on to have a very successful career. Since then, I would do it all over again if I had to retell story number 10 from high school. This big, athletic girl used her height and strength to bully the shorter guys, including myself. She was tough, extremely athletic, and had a reputation for being intimidating. One day, after she had been pushing me around, I became so angry that I wrote something really hurtful about her in pencil on a stairwell. I instantly regretted it, tried to erase it, but was unable to do so, so I fled when she saw it. Was furious and thought her ex-boyfriend was responsible. She confronted him and attacked him in the schoolyard. The incident escalated from what I wrote, and I never told anyone. I was 13 at the time, and she was 17 years later. I ran into her and discovered that she had moved to a different school after the suspension and had to undergo years of anger management therapy as a result of that incident. What's wild is that although she came from a wealthy family, she didn't really have a difficult life, she just had a streak of anger like no one I've ever seen. She is still one of the most irascible people I've ever met, and I still feel a little bad about what I did. Story 11. My daughter isn't biologically mine. My wife and I have been together since 2011. In 2018, I hit my lowest point and relapsed severely. She left me. That was the wake-up call I needed to turn my life around. I got clean, fully recovered, and we got back together shortly after she became pregnant. We had previously suffered 4 miscarriages, so I saw the birth of our daughter as a blessing. When I held her for the first time, she was about a week old, and she gave me the biggest smile which she reserved for me. I love her more than anything, and she is the reason I work hard every day and stay clean. Her biological father, from what I've been told, is a meth addict who has harmed many people, and he lives within 50 miles of us without realizing I'm involved. That's starting to worry me, but I can't seem to convince my wife to agree to it. Our daughter is almost 4 years old and will soon start calling me dad, and she will understand what that means. It's a complicated situation because my dad and I have a tense history because my mom kept me away from him for 18 years. I don't know how they would respond to this news, but I just want to move far away where I can feel safe with my daughter because I love her so much. Story 12. I committed adultery to escape an abusive marriage because my first husband was mentally and emotionally abusive, but I didn't fully understand the extent of it at the time. Looking back, I realize how much my relationship was shaped by this. I haven't told anyone about these fears, not even my friends down here in the rural South. Raising a child that isn't biologically yours feels like one of the biggest taboos, and sometimes it makes me feel weak, but nothing matters more to me than my daughter, who is my entire world. He left his wife and we started an affair because of something like Stockholm Syndrome. Most people thought I did it for physical reasons, but in reality, I was hoping my husband would get upset and throw me out because I was his property and he fought to keep me. Eventually, I found the strength to leave on my own, and I've been happily married for 32 years, so long that everyone assumes it's. I don't talk about it because the affair wasn't about the physical connection, but rather about survival. I wish I'd been strong enough to leave the right way, but at the time, it felt like my only option. Story 13. A friend of mine underwent one of those 23andMe DNA tests to find out more about her genetic background and health predispositions. No one knows the whole truth, and my children all call my current husband dad. She thought it might be a cousin she had never met because we are both South Asian and our families are large, so it didn't seem like a big deal when she saw a distant relative living in New York listed. However, a few weeks later, she received a friend request on Facebook from a man who shared her last name. He sent her a direct message saying, "Hey, I know this sounds crazy, but I think you might be my half-sister." She was extremely skeptical and freaked out, initially ignoring him, but the man and his wife continued contacting her through various. When my friend's father immigrated to the US in the late 1980s, he allegedly had an affair with a woman in New York. According to the guy, the father left the state before the boy was born and never knew he existed. He took the 23andMe test to prove his paternity and shared some extremely detailed and accurate information about my friend's father that made it difficult to ignore his story. Eventually, I persuaded her to speak with her father in private. Other than that, I don't know much about their conversation, but I am aware that her father was totally taken by surprise and that he even left their home for a short time a few years ago. Everything seems to be going well between my friend and her family now, but I have never brought it up again and I never will. Story 14. My story is probably quite mild in comparison to others, but here it is. I am in my 30s, and my conservative Christian family believes that I am straight, that I have only ever dated 1 or 2 women, and that my current girlfriend of 4 years is cisgender. My girlfriend knows everything about me. She's trans and passes for a woman, and I fully support her in everything she does and in who she is. I will never tell my family any of this, not because I'm afraid of their reaction. My mom in particular wouldn't take it well, but because I don't think it's any of their business, it's personal, and they wouldn't care. The truth is, woman, I'm very open sexually and don't believe in the no sex before marriage rule. I've been with women, men, trans people, cross-dressers, and even had threesomes. I won't tell them that my girlfriend is trans because she doesn't want anyone to know. It's her decision, and I respect it completely. She is a woman, plain and simple, and if the truth were to come out, I would stand by her 100%. If anyone, including my family, had a problem with it, they could deal with losing me too. To me, love and respect for her are more important than anything else. Story 15. I've never discussed this topic in such a way before, and I'm posting anonymously because of the whole. I've only ever told 2 people in my life, one who lives halfway across the world and one who is a trusted friend, about my father's frequent physical abuse of me when I was younger. It wasn't always overt, but activities like slapping my butt, groping my thighs, and similar behaviors were consistent for as long as I can remember. If I ever brought it up with my family, I know they would gaslight me and try to convince me that I'm misremembering things or that it was all just play, but I remember everything clearly. I remember how he would get upset if I told him to stop if he was intoxicated, and he would laugh it off as if it didn't happen. This is why I detest it when adults touch me, and it's also one of the reasons I intend to cut off all contact with my family as soon as I leave for college. I recently turned 18, and being at home has become intolerable. I spend as much time as possible outside the house, staying out late and driving aimlessly in my car. I've started looking into seeing a psychiatrist without my parents knowing because I'm trying to address the obvious mental health issues I've developed and figure out how to treat them. I'm trying to take responsibility for my healing if I refuse to get better when I have the opportunity to do so. I'm spending less time at home because my friends and girlfriend are the only people who truly matter to me anymore. Family doesn't mean much to me now that I'm 18. Thank you for providing a platform for people to share stories like this one. 16 years ago, a drug dealer I knew asked me to hold onto a package of money for him. He was bad news. He sold cocaine and heroin and was awaiting trial for his third offense. He assumed that since I wasn't involved in the game, I was someone he could trust, and he was right. He handed me a bag containing $125,000. I don't want to burden myself anymore or burden the people in my life, even if it's anonymously. He called me every week or so for months, asking me to peel off $5,000 and meet him to hand it over in $100 bills that were only about 5 or 6 inches thick. I always did as he asked, and eventually it was down to the last $10,000, but he was caught selling while out on bond this time, and there was no way out, and he ended up getting sentenced to 20 years in prison. After his sentencing, his girlfriend started calling me for the remaining money, but I ignored her knowing that she would probably. He killed himself in prison after blowing it on drugs 1 month into his sentence. I kept the $10,000 and never told anyone about Story 17. Let me begin by stating that I'm not a danger to myself or others, and that won't change, but aside from that, I feel like I'm done with life. I've been living with severe sciatica and chronic pain for almost 4 years, and it's completely changed my life. I'm disabled enough that I can't work, but not so disabled that there is substantial help available to me beyond what provincial healthcare covers. I still manage to do most of the shopping and cooking, and I love making meals for my wife and daughters, but beyond that, I have no desires left for myself. Over the past few years, I've gradually let go of my own wants and ambitions. I can't bring myself to read books anymore, and even watching new movies or TV shows feels like too much work, even though I still want to enjoy them. I save most of my energy for the evenings when my wife and I watch something new together. The rest of the day, I just exist. It would break her heart if she knew I felt this way, but if there were a solution, I'd take it in a heartbeat. However, everything that can be done has already been tried, and my condition is degenerative, so it's only going to get worse. On most days, I end up re-watching things I've seen before or listening to the same music I've loved for years. Even though things are getting worse, I still have time left, and I'm determined to use it to support my family in any way I can. It's difficult enough that I haven't received a paycheck in years, but there are still ways I can help, and I do. Story 18. In 2008, my employer offered a tuition reimbursement program. The terms were straightforward: as long as you kept your grade at a 3.0 GPA or higher, they reimbursed your tuition costs at the end of each semester. You paid in advance, submitted your grades at the end of the semester, and they reimbursed you. Any financial aid or scholarships would be subtracted from the total. I studied network security and maintained a perfect 4.0 average, but I wasn't entirely honest. I falsified my receipts to make it appear as though I was paying out of pocket. My employer paid for my entire tuition, and my scholarships covered the rest. By the time I graduated, I had paid off my house, bought a brand new car, and had $10,000 left over. I graduated debt-free, with no credit card debt or student loans, and I started a full-time job with benefits that paid $80,000 annually. For those who believe I cheated on my employer, you're right, but it was Yazaki North America, a company that engaged in shady practices like busting unions and possibly using third-world labor. I eventually left for a better job out of state because of their exploitation and environmentally damaging activities, and when I heard how hard they were hit during the 2020 auto industry shutdowns, I couldn't help but laugh. Story 19. I've been caring for someone for years, but I've never told them about it. It's been eating away at me, and I feel like I need to say it aloud, even if it's just here. The truth is that I'm in love with my best friend, and we've been friends for as long as I can remember. They have developed into something more than just friendship, but I've never expressed my feelings to them because I'm afraid of upsetting our relationship. I know it's selfish, but I can't help it. Every time we get together, I find myself staring at them and imagining what our life might be like if we were together. However, reality sets in and they're happily dating someone else, and I could never be the one to ruin their happiness, even if they were single. It's exhausting to keep living this way, torn between wanting to confess and wanting to keep what we have. Maybe one day I'll find the courage to tell them, even if it means losing them. At least then I might finally find peace and comfort. I keep my feelings bottled up and try to act normal. It's not easy, but I don't know any other way to protect our friendship. Part of me knows I should tell them the truth, but I'm paralyzed by fear. In story 20, a church friend invited me over to play Barbies when I was in elementary school. She had a lot of cool toys, including a tiny, detailed toy can of dog food, which I wanted for some reason. My Barbies didn't even have pets, so I didn't need it, but it represented something larger to me. It was a piece of the normal life. I yearned for a real family home, a stable place where you could mark your height on the closet door year after year instead of moving to a new apartment every time the rent went up. I couldn't help myself. I assumed that if I put my name on it, my friend wouldn't realize it was hers. I reasoned that since she had so many toys, one small piece wouldn't matter. However, when she came to my apartment to play with my cheap Barbie knockoffs, she recognized it right away and asked about it. I lied to her in an attempt to dispel her suspicions, and that was the end of our friendship. Years later, I never told her the truth. My name is Walter Hartwell White, and I live at 308 Negra Arroyo Lane in Albuquerque, New Mexico 87104. This is my confession. I met her at a club when we were both adults. We had a pleasant conversation over the music, catching up for a little while, but I forgot to apologize for the stupid toy. I still think about that moment and wish I could have apologized, but it was such a small thing, but it ended a friendship, and it has stayed with me all these years. Hank approached me with a startling proposal shortly after my 50th birthday. He wanted me to use my knowledge of chemistry to cook methamphetamine, which he would then sell using his connections in the drug world from his career with the DEA. I was shocked because I had always thought of Hank as a moral man, but I was also vulnerable at the time, something he knew and took advantage of because I had recently been diagnosed with cancer. For more than a year, the DEA has been clandestinely building a meth empire using me as his chemist. I regret that decision every day because I was weak and desperate to keep my family from financial ruin. Hank took me on a ride and showed me how much money even a small meth operation could generate. He then partnered with a man named Gustavo Fring, who seemed like a legitimate businessman but turned out to be far more dangerous than I could have imagined. Hank basically sold me into servitude to Fring, and when I tried to quit, Fring threatened my family's belongings. Intensified after Hank and Fring had a falling out. Fring had refused to give Hank a larger portion of the profits, so Hank plotted to kill him. After Fring died, Hank rose in the DEA ranks, used his power to control me even more, taking my children for 3 months to keep me in line. My wife, who had not been aware of my illegal activities, was appalled when she learned why Hank had taken our children, and we were terrified and trapped in a nightmare. I tried to quit again recently, but Hank made it clear that I would never be able to leave. I live in constant fear that Hank will kill me or worse, hurt my family. I don't know what else to do, so this confession is my last hope to expose Hank for who he really is and to get out of this living hell. Story 22. I'm so lonely that I cry myself to sleep. My friend group seems to have unconsciously chosen me to be the target of abuse at work. I work in customer service, and I'm frequently reprimanded between work and my friends. I think I'm a decent person, I'm not particularly attractive or interesting, and I don't have any real hobbies, so when I'm not going out with friends, I'm just at home alone in total silence. What hurts the most is that whenever I try to connect with someone, it never works, and I never even know why. All of the comments I hear are negative, including ones I direct at myself. Hearing more negativity from my friends, who frequently use everything I say as a joke or an insult against me. It's like I'm the court jester. Sometimes I laugh because I need the release, but other times I feel melancholy, and even that gets criticized. I've considered bringing it up, but I know how it would go. We had a former friend who left the group under similar circumstances, but she also did something terrible to someone, and bringing it up would only make me seem worse, even though I have friends who. I'm not that person for anyone. I feel like I'm invited to events just to be the LCH line, not because people value my company. I'm not Sewell, and I don't want to hurt myself or anyone else. I'm lonely because I don't have that special connection with anyone. My friends all have partners or best friends that they rely on for everything. I wish I had someone who genuinely wanted to spend time with me, someone who made me feel valued. I don't want to live my entire life alone in my apartment talking to people. I've grown tired of people and their dogs ruining my day, so the idea of having a place where I can keep everyone out is really alluring. My less confrontational option is to erect a barbed wire fence around the perimeter and plant cacti inside the property. I just want to feel like my presence matters to someone. Story 23. Sometimes I dream about living on a large remote property, posting warning signs and making it clear that no one, not even people or their dogs, are welcome without my permission. The interior of the property would be lovely, a private sanctuary that I would never want to leave, but the border would send a clear message that you are not welcome here. I now understand why the wealthy do everything in their power to amass wealth and distance themselves from ordinary people, who are generally exhausting to deal with because they are constantly in the way, making unnecessary noise, leaving messes, being thoughtless or lazy, and generally being a pain in the neck. If I hear another barking dog wake me up, I swear I will lose it, at least in my head. My ultimate fantasy right now is to escape and create a private paradise where I don't have to deal with the chaos and stupidity of others. God, I wish I were rich. Story 24. My family and friends think I joined the military in 2003 out of a sense of duty to my country, but the truth is much more complicated when I consider that I'm not like them. I crave peace, privacy, and exclusivity. Living like everyone else drives me crazy because I feel like I'm not like them. When I was 19, I was raped in college. A few people are aware of this, but they are unaware that he recorded the assault and promised to give me the tape if I returned to his house. When I did, everything was set up again, including the blankets and the camera, and he raped me once more. I begged him for the tape, but he told me he had already sold it online. The shame consumed me, and I dropped out of college after seeing my rapist on campus at the beginning of a new semester. I sobbed and fled to my car. Left all of my classes right away. My father, who had paid for my education, was incensed when I left school, and our relationship ended. A few years later, I enlisted in the military, not out of patriotism, but because I believed that dying in Iraq would make sense to people. I volunteered for every risky assignment, fully expecting to die before turning 26, but I didn't. Instead, I returned home, and it was more difficult than I had anticipated. I didn't trust people, didn't have close friends, and didn't see. I found a reason to continue working for 10 years, doing my best to keep myself occupied until I was medically retired. Looking back, I think that my time in the military was the best of my life because of the structure and inherent risks, which gave me a sense of purpose. I'm currently in therapy, trying to piece together a future for myself, but I doubt I'll ever tell my family the whole story because the shame, mistrust, and lack of direction still linger even as I try to move forward. Story 25. In order to avoid conflict, I've decided to let it go for the time being. However, the cost of that decision has been isolating myself. I've stopped going to places where I might see him, which means I don't see my friends much anymore. It's been really difficult, and I'm deeply disappointed in him, but I'm even more disappointed in myself for keeping this going. My best friend raped my ex-girlfriend, and I can't talk about it with anyone because she doesn't want anything to happen. He doesn't even know that I know we have all the same friends and frequent the same places. I don't even care if they had gotten along, that wouldn't have bothered me. What bothers me is that he pretended to be her friend, preyed on her, and assaulted her. I don't know where this cruelty or animosity came from, but it's allegedly not the first time he's had problems with women. My ex had no reason to lie to me about what happened. She had nothing to gain. She told me that after it happened, he blamed me and even rubbed it in her face, which is horrifying. I wasn't there. Story 26. My elderly neighbor Luron was blackmailing me. Normally, he would ask me to fix his car, help his wife in the garden, and drive him to appointments. However, one day, he knocked on my door and told me that their collie Samson was getting old at the age of 14. I don't have a problem taking action, but I can tell that my ex isn't the only one who's hurt. I just want to make sure I do what's best for everyone involved. Most importantly, I don't want anyone else to suffer. Luron said they didn't have the money to put him down and asked me to do it. I flatly refused, saying that if he couldn't afford it, I couldn't either. Then he said, "You got that cowboy gun, don't you?" I still refused, but Samson seemed fine, so I offered to take him instead. Luron pushed me further, reminding me that he had been keeping my secret for months and that he wasn't asking for much, just a courtesy for Samson. Reluctantly, I agreed that Sunday while my wife was at church, I took Samson out for a final wonderful day. We went for a long drive, got ice cream, hamburgers and chicken nuggets, and played fetch at the beach. Samson was energetic like a puppy again, so I considered leaving him there in the hopes that someone would find him, but instead I drove to a nearby forest and walked him in for about a mile, deciding it was far enough. The problem is that I wasn't a hunter, so I didn't know anything about dog anatomy, so when I eventually worked up the courage to pull the trigger, I missed Samson, who was hurting and maimed. I was so shaken that I didn't bury him. Instead, I just left and went straight to bed when I got home. The following morning, I received a voicemail from Leon's wife asking if I had seen Samson. I went to his house and he confirmed that he hadn't told her, saying it was better for her to think Samson had wandered off and still hold out hope. I thought that was cruel, but I didn't argue. A few days later, his wife stopped me in the driveway and said she and her. When I asked if Luron was helping, his granddaughter had been driving all over town looking for Samson. She laughed bitterly and said, "He's glad he's gone. He's hated that dog since I got him." That's when it finally hit me that I had been tricked into killing his wife's cherished pet for no other reason than his own selfishness. I felt like throwing up. When his wife asked me if I was okay, I lied and said I felt a migraine coming on. I went home and never spoke to her again. I started playing the piano at the age of 5 and continued until I was around 12. When I was 9 or 10, I started lessons at the home of a married woman who, in my memory, was in her 30s. She was my favorite teacher by far. She was fun and engaging and even transcribed songs I liked into sheet music for me to play. I have happy memories of her, but I can't recall why I stopped playing the piano altogether at that point. Samson was one of the kindest and most trusting dogs I'd ever met. He deserved a better story. Wonderful people, with whom I have a great relationship, and who don't seem to remember why I stopped whenever I bring it up. They say they don't remember her name or the reason I quit, but they always seem a little uncomfortable when the subject comes up. I didn't give it much thought until recently, when I was talking to a friend of mine who was about my age. We didn't know each other at the time, but it turned out that he also took piano lessons at the same woman's home. He loved her lessons too, but stopped going around the same time I did. His parents give him similarly evasive answers when he asks me why he stopped, but one particular memory sticks out to us both. The house had a staircase leading to a small storage room off to the side with a stained glass window that we both found cool. The problem was that there was no reason for us to go upstairs because everything related to the lessons was on the first floor, but we both vividly remember being upstairs in that small room. Neither of us knows what to make of it, but the whole situation feels stranger the more we consider it. Story 28. About 11 years ago, my cousin and I discovered a dead body in my grandparents' farm fields under a tree. The man was dressed in a black shirt and brown pants and had no shoes. He had likely been dead for a day or so when we discovered him. His skin was gray and greenish, his body was inflamed, and there were flies all over the place. At first, we were shocked and just stared at the body, but for reasons I can't quite understand, my cousin and I decided to bury him ourselves. I was 11 and my cousin was 12 years old when we became engrossed in the idea of solving the mystery of the dead body. Like detectives in a movie, we searched for clues but found nothing unusual. In retrospect, we regretted not looking for any signs of foul play before burying him. I stayed with the body while my cousin got a shovel. When he returned, we prayed for the man and buried him with as much respect as we could manage. We chose to wait and see if there was any news about a missing person in the area instead of telling our family. We discreetly asked around to see if any employees or locals had seen someone who fit his description, but nobody had. We realized too late that even if something came up, we couldn't reveal what we'd done without being asked why we hadn't reported it sooner. As of right now, there hasn't been a single report or mention of someone missing. The grave is deep enough and in such a remote location that no one else is likely to find it, only the two of us, and now you all know it's there. Even after all these years, we still discreetly search for hints about who he might have been. Story May 29th. Not compare to some other stories, but it's one of those little foundational childhood memories that stuck with me. Dead that matches what we found. My cousin and I are still close and we've kept this secret between us. We even visit the grave whenever we return to our grandparents' farm. My sister, who was about a year younger than me, asked if she could have some shrimp too when my grandparents, who reared me and my sister, brought home dinner from Long John Silver's when I was around 8 or 9 years old. My grandmother explained that she had ordered a large order of shrimp for us to share, and I felt bad for eating them all, but I didn't want to get into trouble, so I gave my sister the package with just the tails. She eagerly grabbed the tails, took a bite out of it, and immediately spat it out, declaring that she hated the texture and taste. That night stuck with me for decades because I felt guilty because I thought I had deprived my sister of something she might have loved for the next 20 years. She refused to try shrimp, believing she hated it. When we were in our late 20s, she tried shrimp again and loved it, and that's when I admitted that I had eaten all the shrimp and only given her the tails. It's been about 15 years since I told her and 35 years since the shrimp tail incident, but I still feel a tiny twinge of guilt now, and at least we can laugh about it. Now, story 30. 7 years ago, I got my high school bully and 6 of his friends expelled. She laughed so hard she could hardly breathe, and she couldn't believe I had carried that guilt for so long. She lives by the ocean and eats shrimp all the time. He had no legitimate reason to target me, but he made it his mission to make my life miserable. The worst part is that no one ever stood up for me when I tried to defend myself because he was one of the cool kids. One night, as I was returning to my room at the boarding school, I found my door locked from the inside, and when I peered through, I saw my bully and 6 of his popular friends beating the living daylights out of my roommate. The next morning, I found out that my roommate had no intention of reporting the attack to the school administration because he had gone to the clinic for treatment, but the doctor reported the incident to the school because the 7 boys were so popular that they were able to get the entire grade to agree on a false story as their alibi. At least a dozen students were watching the event, and I chose to stay calm and go to bed rather than risk becoming their next target. I saw my opportunity and went straight to the school counselor to tell them the truth about the attack and the false alibi the boys had planned. When the disciplinary board questioned the bullies, their story fell apart right away, and within a week, all 7 of them were expelled. The rest of the school was devastated, with people crying and even throwing a farewell party for the bullies. I pretended to be sad, but on the inside, I was ecstatic. I had never felt so satisfied watching someone. I hope karma continues to give you exactly what you deserve. Story 31. When I was a teenager, I used to make prank phone calls to little old ladies. I would look through the phone book and pick names that sounded elderly, like Agatha Mildred, and then pretend to be an old lady named Bertha calling her dear old friend. Looking back, it was such a silly and immature thing. Last I heard, my bully is still struggling at a vocational college while I finished my ACA studies on a scholarship. The women would usually tell me I had the wrong number and that was the end of it, but one day I called a woman named Lottie, and she surprised me by saying something like, "Hello Bertha, it's so nice to hear from you, how are you?" I hadn't expected that at all, but we ended up talking, and it became a regular thing. Lottie was a lonely widow whose kids rarely called, and our weekly phone conversations became something she looked forward to. I felt bad because I wasn't really. One day when I called, a man answered the phone and told me his mother Lottie had passed away. He then thanked me for being such a good friend to her and said our calls had meant the world to her. I never told anyone about La or those phone calls. Bertha, however, didn't have the heart to stop calling, so I let her do the majority of the talking and used context clues to keep the conversations going. I even started watching One Life to Live just so I could talk to her about it. This continued for about a year. I was sitting on the couch when I thought back on the conversations and realized how much they must have meant to her. In a way, they also meant something to me. Thank you for reminding me of Lottie, a dear friend I never really got to know but who had a profound impact on my life. Story 32. When I was in 3rd grade, my dad and stepmom left me home alone with my stepmom's younger brother watching over me. I had never met him before, and he usually stayed in his room whenever we visited my stepmom's parents. I believe he was in his early 20s. He came out of his room while I was watching TV and asked if I wanted to play a game. Since I was an only child and was frequently by myself, I enthusiastically agreed, excited to spend time with an older person. We went to the bathroom, and he asked me to close my eyes and guess what he was putting in my mouth. What happened was extremely inappropriate, and it has haunted me ever since. I didn't understand what was happening at the time, so he called it a game and told me it was a secret not to share with anyone. After that day, I never saw him again, and we hardly ever went to my stepmother's house. However, the experience stayed with me, and in my youth, I even recommended similar games to my classmates. It wasn't until I grew older and learned about boundaries and right from wrong that I realized how I had been manipulated and victimized. As an adult, the trauma of what happened still weighs heavily on me. In addition to the burden of being an abuse survivor, I also struggle with the guilt of unintentionally spreading the harmful behavior I was subjected to, which has had a long-term negative impact on my emotional and mental health. Challenges like depression, anger, and substance abuse. I've also struggled with questions about who I am. I identify as gay, but I can't help but wonder if my experiences shaped this or if I would have realized this on my own. It's a painful thought that makes things worse. When I finally told my father about my experiences 40 years later, his response was heartbreaking. He dismissed my pain, blamed me for being weak, and cut off contact. Contributed to my feelings of worthlessness and rage. I've experienced several suicide attempts and periods of extreme depression, but I'm still here. I try to keep hope and work toward a better future one day at a time, even though some days are easier than others. I still think there is hope for happiness and healing. Story 33. My first job after college was as a high school teacher. I was only 21 years old, and I looked so young that the administration insisted that I wear a suit every day to look more professional and less like the. I tutored students who were having trouble with language arts, and one girl, who was 17 at the time, started going to an honors class on a regular basis and said she liked the way I explained things. Over time, she started asking me out at school functions and during lunch, and we began to fall in love. I was miserable at my job as a teacher, and my girlfriend at the time, a teacher who had just graduated from college, was going through her own difficulties. She eventually lost her job, fell into depression, and our relationship deteriorated until we broke up. I told a friend about my feelings for the student after the holidays, and she reported it to the school. An investigation was done, and although it was found that there was no physical relationship, I was asked to resign, which I had already planned to do. A month later, I was still living with my ex-girlfriend, and our relationship became tense. One night, an argument got out of hand, and we broke things around the house. The following morning, the police were at my door. I spent 6 months in jail awaiting trial after being arrested and charged with multiple felonies related to the incident. During this time, my ex-girlfriend acknowledged that she had fabricated the incident to get me out of the house, and she hired a lawyer to try to help, but the damage was done. My lawyer suggested that I accept a plea deal to avoid a drawn-out legal battle, and I grudgingly agreed. It has been almost 20 years since that trying year of my life, but the guilt and regret still linger despite numerous victories in. Story 34. When I was around 7 or 8 years old, my family and I were moving. There were 5 of us, my parents, 2 sisters and I, crammed into a minivan full of boxes and belongings. I was in the back seat, surrounded by boxes, while my sisters were in the middle seats and my parents were up front. Those events have hung over me like a shadow ever since, serving as a constant reminder of the mistakes and struggles I went through. And my parents told me to go to sleep, but I wasn't tired, so I was bored and stared out the window when I felt something flick the back of my shoes. At first, I thought it was just some clothes shifting in the van, but the flicking kept happening, so I started to get scared. When I finally decided to look under the seat, I felt something grab my feet. The hands were black, scaly, and had large claws. They pulled at my feet as if they were trying to drag me under. Panicked, I pulled my feet back and screamed, and my parents asked what was wrong, but I was too afraid to disclose. Muttered something about having a bad dream, and my mother insisted that I try to sleep. I never set foot on the van's floor again, but I can still clearly recall the feeling of the claws grabbing me and the warmth of the hands, despite the fact that the van was extremely cold. I've never had anything similar again, but I still think about it a lot, and even as an adult, I find it difficult to explain what happened that night, leaving me to wonder if it was real or just in my head. Story 35. My dad was a complex man who was frequently abusive, and he struggled with ongoing health issues. During the week he passed away. He had been admitted to the hospital and was already below K&E, but the doctors decided that he needed to have the rest of his leg amputated. At the time, I was a freshman in college, and I spent most of my days on campus studying and doing my homework. I also didn't have my own car, so my mom would drop me off and pick me up every day. One evening, my mom spent the entire day at the hospital with my dad. When I returned home, she went to pick me up so we could go home together. I put my things down, got a snack, and said to my mom, who was in the kitchen with me, "This is what it would be like if it was just the 2 of us." The house was quiet and peaceful, with no yelling, no swearing, and none of the negative energy that usually hovered over us when my dad was around. That night, I dozed off in my parents' room while watching TV with my mom at 3 in the morning. When the phone rang, the hospital informed us that my dad had died of cardiac arrest. Looking back, I believe we both knew in our hearts that his time was running out because in the final 2 weeks of his life, he changed in ways I never would have imagined. He became friendlier, listened to my problems without passing judgment, and treated my mom better. One evening, they went grocery shopping together, and my mom later told me that it was the most fun they had ever had in their entire marriage, even the tone he used when speaking. Others changed, and he called a friend to tell me how much fun we had at the Super Bowl and to say that his final act was to make amends with my aunt and sister. They had always had a complicated relationship, reflecting each other's cruelty and abusive tendencies, but they also shared an unbreakable bond. My dad called and said he didn't want to fight anymore, crying and saying that they were the only family they had left. At one point, my mom looked at me and said she had a feeling my dad was going to. The day before he passed away, I dismissed it by calling her crazy, but something inside of me told me to say, "I love you." I had never said that to him before growing up because I was afraid of him and honestly harbored a lot of hatred for him, but I did it without hesitation at that moment. I've thought about that moment countless times since his death, and I believe I did it because I didn't want to carry guilt afterwards. I thought those words would free me from him and his manipulation, but I'm still with him every day. I've never told anyone this, but I know my father will always be a part of every decision I make, and I won't let him control me anymore. When I ask myself what my dad would think of this, I remember reminding myself to choose the path that's right for me, not for him. For years, I wished for his death, thinking it would finally free me from him, but his passing didn't end his hold on me. His presence lingers in the form of PTSD, and I frequently catch myself trying to live up to the image he wanted for me, even though I'm slowly breaking away from it. Almost 10 years have passed, and although I'm gradually escaping his shadow, I know he will always be a part of me. The only difference is that I won't allow him to hurt me anymore. Story 36. A close female friend of mine had a traumatic experience when a man she trusted tried to attack her. When she resisted and managed to flee, he abandoned her in a remote area during the dead of winter, knowing she wasn't prepared for the cold. She had to walk several miles to locate a phone and call for assistance. At first, I wanted to confront him directly and make him pay for what he did, but after controlling my anger, I decided on a different strategy that would make his life as uncomfortable as possible without breaking any laws. At the time, I was a fan of practical joke books and similar resources, which gave me plenty of ideas. This happened in the mid-1980s, long before the era of surveillance cameras and online tracking, so there were fewer barriers to specific types of mischief. I started by learning as much as I could about him. I spoke with people who knew him and got information about his habits, address, and phone number without ever meeting him. Once I had enough information, I started my campaign by intercepting his mail to find out more about his personal and financial life. I carefully opened letters and sealed them after copying the information, and eventually I was able to access his utility and phone accounts as well as other subscription services using. I began making his life more difficult after learning this information. I repeatedly canceled his phone and electricity, ordered odd and embarrassing things to be delivered to his house, and signed him up for numerous magazine subscriptions. I even applied for store cards and credit cards in his name. He wasn't receiving much of his mail because I was forwarding it to different addresses through the post office. At one point, I discovered a spare key hidden under his car's bumper, but I never went inside or took his car. I used the key to perform a number of practical jokes, such as switching his license plate with someone else, draining his car's battery, and squirting fish paste into the vents to produce an offensive stench. I even used thread lock on his lug nuts, making it nearly impossible to remove his wheels. One of my more subtle tricks was inserting silicone carbide into the crankcase, which ultimately caused his engine to fail. His persistent frustrations started to negatively impact his relationships and mental health, and he accused his friends of sabotaging him, which resulted in arguments and the dissolution of numerous friendships. This went on for more than 2 years, during which he moved several times. I eventually located his new address and began working again, and eventually he moved out of state to the West Coast, probably to avoid the unending series of bad luck. My friend started to suspect me after learning about all the strange things that were happening to him, and her brother, who knew me well, was positive that I was responsible. I denied everything, claiming that I wouldn't have wasted time with such complex plans if I wanted to discipline him. The best course of action would have been to encourage her to seek support from authorities and loved ones who could ensure her safety. Story 37. My sister was extremely difficult to live with. Some of my friends were violent, destructive, untrustworthy, and purposefully cruel. Looking back, I don't regret protecting my friend, but I know there are healthier ways to handle situations like this. At the time, I felt like I was giving her a sense of justice without putting her in further danger. As you can imagine, this didn't work out well for me. One day during one of her worst episodes, I heard the distinct sound of a bottle of pills rattling. I knew right away what she was planning because she had previously done something similar, which was to take pills and then call her ex to tell him what she'd done. Their parents were not permitted to visit my house because they were truly afraid of her. I thought that if she couldn't call her ex, maybe she would stop or follow through on her threats. In any case, I hoped that the chaos would finally end. After that, I went for a walk, but apparently I wasn't quick enough because she managed to make the call before I disconnected the line, and her ex wasted no time calling 911 when I heard the sirens approaching. I wasn't relieved, but rather disappointed when asked about the disconnected phone lines. Years later, I still don't feel bad about what I did. I've considered what might have happened, but it doesn't bother me as much as you might think. That said, I don't take it lightly. My sister caused years of suffering and trauma for everyone around her. I have no idea where she is now or what she's doing, and honestly, I don't care. I pretended I didn't know about the pills. I told my parents we had been fighting, and I unplugged the phone just to irritate her and get back at her. While I want to help her, I often feel exhausted and guilty when I can't meet her demands. The problem is that it keeps me from focusing on my own mental health and well-being, and sometimes I feel like this cycle will only end when she dies, even though the thought of losing her terrifies me. She is the best parent. There are 5 of us siblings, and none of us really know how to function properly as adults. I genuinely believe she may have narcissistic personality disorder. My siblings have distanced themselves and seem unconcerned, which I understand given the neglect we all endured as children. I wish I could detach myself the way they have, but I just can't. My secret is that occasionally I found myself looking forward to her leaving, a thought I've never shared. She frequently spends all of her money, leaving her unable to afford necessities like heating, and I feel obligated to step in even if it means struggling to pay my own bills or buy food with anyone because it makes me feel like a bad person and a bad daughter. This has been more of a vent than anything else, but writing it down has been a little comfort. I know these emotions are complex, but I hope that one day I will be able to strike a better balance between looking after myself and helping her.